I'm John Callis. I am the CTO of PGP Corporation, and there are the four of us when we're talking about traffic analysis, and you can read the title of it. I have Raven Alder over there, Ricardo Bittanti, and Nick Mathewson. The very first thing to wonder about traffic analysis is, okay, so what is it? Because there are actually lots of things that you could consider it to be. So I wrote a good definition, which is that it is signals intelligence that ignores content and is only looking at metadata. That's pretty broad, but it describes exactly what you're doing. You're not looking at the fact that communications is happening or even that computations are happening. Use emergent properties of that to figure out what's going on. In Land's book, they wrote a great quote that I have there, which is that traffic analysis, not cryptanalysis, is the backbone of communications intelligence. It has always been equally as important as cryptanalysis. Now, what's interesting metadata? Endpoint addresses, who's talking to whom, timing, when did it start, when did it stop, duration, who talks, what sequence do things go, what are actually timing differences between the sequencing. For example, suppose that you have a famous bank robber and you learn that the famous bank robber always calls his priest the day before he's going to rob a bank. Well, if all you know is that the bank robber called his priest, you can then be on alert. And that's traffic analysis. It's looking at the fact that the traffic occurred. So this is an important thing, and the reason it's important is that we tend to discount it. I first started analysis in dealing with PGP because people would ask me questions like, well, how do I keep them, whoever your adversary is, from knowing that I'm using PGP? And the answer is you can't. There are such things as steganography and so on, but in general they don't work, and arguably, and I'll have the argument later, are worse than doing nothing at all. So the fact that you are using secure communications is in fact an interesting thing. And if you're the only one using secure communications, it's more important than lots of people doing it. So, part of communities to get, why everybody should be encrypting things and why you should encrypt that mail to your mother is that you are reducing the signal that using something that is secure is. And we all have to think differently about traffic analysis itself. I include myself and other people who are even experts in this as well. Senator Ted Stevens, who you may know as the guy who talked about the internet is full of tubes. We all laugh about this, but this is a smart guy who merely doesn't have the right metaphors and is merely ignorant. He's obviously thinking, he just doesn't have the right things to fit together to know that it doesn't work the way that his metaphor is doing. And we need to think differently about that because attackers who are the serious attackers now are not doing what we think. I still hear all the time the jokes about, if you want a job with the government, pick up the phone and call your mother and say, hey, I'd like a job with the government. But that's not what they're looking at. They're not looking at the content. They're looking at the metadata. This is also an immature discipline, and if you are a researcher, the two words immature discipline should make you smile because what that means is there's lots of easy work to be done, you just have to figure out what it is. So there's a lot of capacity to do interesting things if you want a new thing to research here. So historically, traffic analysis has been used in the military. It's used to find lots of things about the opponent. And similarly, fake traffic gets generated to hide these things. It also gets used in marketing research. When marketers look at trends that determine how much will be charged for ads, how successful a campaign is doing, what they're really doing is, in fact, traffic analysis. It's also a really good way to reconfigure networks. If you know what flow rates are, what data rates are, I mean, all of these sort of thing of how you optimize the use of your network is all traffic analysis. It's all the same thing. So why would you, say if you're an attacker, start doing traffic analysis? And the first reason is, of course, crypto. If you have people using crypto that you can't break, then you are reduced to traffic analysis. But even 10 years ago, somebody that I can no longer remember said something insightful to me, which was that if we could wave a magic wand and make everything on the net everywhere encrypted with 40-bit crypto, it would substantially, it would eliminate the ability of governments to tap the network because they can't even break 40-bit crypto on that scale of everywhere. That, you know, even though you could break one session in a few milliseconds, you have to break them all in a few milliseconds. You can agree with this or disagree with the actual numbers, but the point is that when you start getting crypto that really works and you're an attacker, you have to go to traffic analysis. Also, if you get overwhelmed by data, which can happen without crypto, you have to figure out what to do. There isn't enough room, there isn't enough data bandwidth on the spindles that you would want to suck the entire net into to be able to do that. The most important reason, though, is that it's really hard, maybe even impossible, to defend against traffic analysis. The attacker can't deal with something that is a one-to-one scale map. You know, that's you know, it's a Stephen Wright joke. You know, I made a map and it's a one-to-one scale, and you know, a one-to-one scale map is worthless. The reason that we have maps is that they are not the territory. Friend of mine, Drew Gross, who's a forensic researcher that I worked with at Counterpane for a number of years, used to say, "I love cryptography. It tells me what parts of the system not to bother attacking." And, you know, if you're a cryptographer, that makes you go, and this is part of it. So how do you defend against traffic analysis? Well, the best one is you don't communicate, which, that's kind of a joke. The other thing is that you don't be seen communicating. Spread spectrum was originally designed as a way to keep an opponent, keeping you from seeing to be communicating. And 20, 30 years ago, it was a huge hush-hush secret that governments had, and now every one of us probably in this room has a spread spectrum device, and probably 2 or 3 with them. And the reason that we do that is, in fact, to not be seen to be communicating, because interference is, in fact, being seen to be communicating. So, you know, it all feeds on itself of how you efficiently use your network and how you figure out what's going on in the network. It's all the same thing and all interlocked. Now, a lot of the naive defenses are worse than nothing, and Ricardo's going to have some great graphs on this, and I have there, everything you know is wrong, because the first thing someone thinks is, aha, I will send out constant rate traffic. And constant rate traffic, they won't know which one is the real traffic and which one it isn't. Well, actually, it turns out, and you'll see some nice graphs and numbers, that this, if you don't do it exactly right, and maybe even if you do it at all, actually makes the attacker's job easier. Metaphor that I use on this is if you think of a factory that's putting out box cars, and some of them are empty and some of them are full, and all of the empty box cars are separated by 1 foot, and all of a sudden you see a box car that's separated by 6 inches, you know that that one's different. And you know it because of 6 inches, not because of anything else. So if you use traffic analysis, what can you do? You know, there are the classic military things that you can do. You can also identify authors of texts. When Joe Klein wrote the book about the Clinton administration called Primary Colors, he wrote it as anonymous, but people used traffic analysis techniques of doing textual analysis, of comparing the words he used, the phrases he used, against other things that he'd written. The people who know how to do this pegged him as their primary guess of who Anonymous was, and he fessed up. You can also crack SSH passwords. You can identify the OS of a remote host. And this is passive fingerprinting. It's all the same thing. You can identify what host it is as it moves around the net. All of these things are papers that if you can't Google them in 10 minutes, go to Johnny Long's talks because he'll tell you how to do this. You can also correlate virtual to physical hosts, so you could tell what VMs are running on what physical machines. You can also take mixed networks and you can unravel them. You can remove redacting. I have a reference to that. I mean, that if you think about it, is relatively simple. You look at how wide the little black box is, and you look at what sort of pixel sizes will fill this up, and it becomes a knapsack problem, which was one of those things we thought would make good public key cryptography, and it doesn't. You can also identify what movies are being played. You can identify what music is being downloaded. You can identify what music is being played based upon all sorts of things. I mean, CDDB itself is a traffic analysis thing. You say, aha, I have a CD and it's got 13 tracks and the times of the tracks are this. What could it be? In general, it comes up with only one. So, there are all sorts of things here that also you can do. Spatially locate hosts, look at social networks. I got called a year ago because it turns out that the NSA is funding research on how to figure out information for MySpace, LinkedIn, Friendster, etc. You can determine an awful lot. This is all traffic analysis. This is also the way that credit card fraud detection works. I mean, if somebody makes a series of $1 purchases at gas stations across a 40-mile swath in about 3 hours, you can pretty much guess that credit card was stolen. So the open questions and things that I want you to think about are not only how do you guard against traffic analysis, because as I said, this is a pretty open discipline, and guarding against it is a hard problem, which means that it's interesting. But how do we use traffic analysis? I think that botnets ultimately can be defeated by using traffic analysis, that you can unravel a botnet by looking at how the traffic goes, and that you can use the same sorts of techniques to figure out where the members are and what they're doing, and that in general it's going to be very difficult, nigh unto impossible, for people who run them to do this because of how hard it is to defend against traffic analysis. I think there are lots of other defensive uses as well, and that's why we want you to start thinking about this as something that we don't think much about at all. In the notes, there's some additional reading that I have. I have the links there. They should be on the CD and other things. George Denises has written a really good talk, and he's got other things up on his websites on introducing traffic analysis. He goes into many of the things that I've discussed in some more detail and has a lot more references, which is one of the reasons that I didn't bother putting them up here. And now I'll hand things over.
Good morning. My name is Ricardo Betati, and I am from Texas A&M University. I have a little bit of facetious title here. I can count your packets, and why should you care? I only can count your packets. I don't care about the content. I don't care about their headers. I don't care where they come from, where they go to. All I do is I count. What can I do with that? And so we enter an area that we call in our group, we call high-frequency traffic analysis, and it's basically timing analysis at high frequencies. So we look at high-resolution timing of those packets. And what I try to make a point here, follow up on what John said, is I would like to show you that it is a threat. It is an obvious threat and has implications on confidentiality of traffic and on security as well. What I also want to show is that countermeasures are very hard to come by. And I will show this in the case of link padding. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Also, one has to be extremely careful. If you don't do things right, you're actually counterproductive. You do things the wrong way. You make it easier rather than harder. Also, what I will show at some examples is that you cannot hide in a crowd. So we always have the hope that as long as we are many, we can hide. Well, we cannot. I will show you that we can get you wherever you hide. And I'm going to show that with wireless world coming down, it's even going to be worse. And I'm going to wrap up on some work on voice over IP. This is work. This is just one picture on work that Dave Wagner and his students did a few years ago and presented at Usenix. This is an application of capturing packet data on an SSH link. Now, SSH has interactivity requirements that if you type on the keyboard, a packet has to be sent. Otherwise, you lose the interactivity that you are expecting from SSH. So basically, by getting timestamps on the packets on the network, you basically get the typing behavior of the user on the keyboard. And that's an old trick that has been done in embassies all over the world for many years. You listen to somebody typing, of course you know who it is typing, but you also know what they are typing. And so here you measure a inter-packet latency in the order of 100 milliseconds. Then you don't get much information, you get 0.5 bit information. But if you measure something in the order of 250 milliseconds, these are the results of Dave Wagner, then you have already 2-bit information, 2.5-bit information about what was typed. Now, the fact that this is without any a priori information. You don't even know that the person is typing English. If you have a priori information, the data rates go up dramatically. So now then it becomes completely relatively simple to break passwords, and that's of course why newer versions of SSH batch the password, and they send it out as one packet and not as individual packets. But of course that doesn't work when you tunnel, that doesn't work for the rest of your interaction. What else can you do with by counting packets or getting the timestamps of packets? This one is our results of listening to a bunch of machines and look at how their timing is. If you look at the power spectra of the time series of those packets that are being sent, you can distinguish the operating system. So here in this particular case, we have a bunch of Linux boxes, a bunch of Windows boxes, and it's very easy to figure out what is what, because that has to do with buffer allocation and so on. If you look at something else in the real-time community, we talk about arrival curves, and these are, if you look at mean square error in the arrival curves, then you can distinguish what the hardware configuration is. This is work done in one afternoon by a non-interested student. So you can imagine how easy it is to get additional information if you get somebody who has the right motivation. This is a bit difficult to read. What we have been doing is we have been doing work on remote bot detection. This is this particular case of honeynets. When you run a virtual honeynet, you need to emulate the timing behavior of the nodes on your honeynet. And the timing behavior is typically done through timers. Now, we know that the timers, and we tend to forget that timers are managed by the timing subsystem of the operating system, and that typically doesn't work that well. So just by looking at the response time distribution of a bunch of ping packets that we send, we get 100% accuracy in determining whether we are talking to a bot or to a honeypot or to a real machine. This is getting a little bit easier with, this is a little bit more difficult, this type of attack, and I apologize that's difficult to see. For newer versions of the Linux kernel, it's still a problem if you run these things on Windows. But we still, even with newer versions of the Linux kernel with very high accuracy, we can detect just based on the timing behavior with very few packets. At the bottom we see it's 30 packets, 30 ping packets. We know already whether it's a bot or not. We play the same game with GameBots as a result of a inter-response time distribution of responses that come from a Rangarok a bot. So it's completely trivial based on the timing behavior to determine whether a particular player is a bot or not. Other people have been doing similar work, traffic analysis for bot detection in multiplayer games, as well. So what you would like to do is you would like to obfuscate the timing behavior you have, your system is displaying. And so one way to do it is through link padding. What you do is you embed your actual real traffic into a constant stream of traffic that is just on the network, right? So you have this constant stream of boxed cars that come out, and some of them contain a car and some of them don't, right? And so that's what we are playing. This is a particular system using some appliance-based implementation of it. And so the idea is, of course, you always would like to make the observer see a constant stream of packets. That's a black line. And then maybe the real traffic is the red line, and so you need to add the green traffic to it so that it becomes. And so we have done a lot of experiments in this particular area, and the bad news is that you can listen radio on that cover channel. If you look at the entropy of the fine timing distributions, you can, now in this particular case, the red line is our estimator of how much traffic is being sent. The blue dotted line is the actual traffic that is being sent. So we very accurately, with very low latency, detect whether traffic is being sent or not. Of course, you can add noise to it. Doesn't change the situation. Now, there, our estimator is barely visible, but it follows that dotted line as well. So link padding, unless you implement it extremely carefully, and that has to do with the interrupt behavior in the system. When a packet comes into your appliance, it causes a hard interrupt and hardware interrupt, and that disturbs the outgoing traffic. And so this is a system. This particular system here, we added noise to make it more difficult to detect, but it still is a problem. Another application is, so I'm now going to change mode a little bit and talk about scenarios, is you would like to build a naive implementation. This is not going to be, this is a system that is not as sophisticated as Tor, for example. But you do a naive implementation of a mixed network. And what you would like to do, mixed networks, they reroute the traffic, they encrypt the traffic, and in order to prevent the timing correlation between incoming and outgoing packets to the network, what they do is they perturb the traffic in the time domain, right? Should be a good idea. You buffer the packets, you send them out after a while. So if somebody has to determine where does an incoming flow end up eventually, so this particular case, we have the incoming flow, we may know statistics about the incoming flow, and we would like to know where does it go out. That particular problem should, in theory, become more difficult if you perturb the traffic inside the network. Now, if you do a careful statistical analysis here, this is using entropy analysis. What we see there is a little line with little blue dots. That's the S0 line. That is just a proxy. That thing doesn't do any perturbation. And the Y line is the detection probability. What is the probability of correctly detecting where the flow is going? And what we see is if we don't do anything, we are better than most of the perturbing schemes that we could come up with. And that has to do with the fact that typically that we are not perturbing just UDP traffic. We are perturbing traffic that is controlled by TCP, which is a feedback control at the two ends of the host. So if you start perturbing the traffic and you play with the timing behavior, you have the two end hosts starting to pump. The feedback control kicks in, and your timing footprint becomes bigger. Also, you would think that if you had more nodes in your mixed network, that then the protection would be better. Actually, the more nodes you have, the more you disturb the TCP behavior, the bigger become the timing footprints, the worse is the behavior of your system. Again, this is a naive implementation. I just would like to make the point here. And they can tell you all about a more sophisticated implementation. Other question, can you hide in a crowd? So we immerse ourselves in clouds and hope that nobody sees what we're doing. Well, what we have done here is why don't they see what we are doing? Is because the observer only gets access to aggregated data, right? So example is you have a preferred customer card from a store, and what you do is you switch this card with all your friends, right? You perturb those cards so that eventually the company only gets access to aggregated data. What I'm going to show you is that that's not going to help. What we have here is measurements on aggregated data that goes into a little switch and comes out from the little switch. So we don't know, we cannot distinguish the flows because we have only access to aggregated data. We only count the packets that go into the switch and packets that go out at the individual ports. What we can do is we can reconstruct exactly what the flows were. And the way this is done using a statistical signal processing methodology called blind source separation, which I would like to illustrate here just for a second. On top we have the original signals. These are your flows. What the observer sees, and it's a little bit difficult to see maybe, the observer sees only aggregates. It sees overlaps of those figures. It never saw the original signal. And at the bottom we see what the observer can reconstruct. So it's like solving a linear equation x is equal a y, but you need to reconstruct x, but you don't know y, but you don't know a either. Here, this is an application where you have a whole bunch of people talking to each other. All we do is we count packets. We count aggregates of packets. We don't know whom those packets belong to, and we can reconstruct the communication matrix. This gets even worse when we go into wireless network. When this is a work that we did on a completely anonymized network. It uses anonymization of MAC addresses, of IP headers. The IP headers are encrypted. It uses link padding, perfect link padding, and we can still separate the particular nodes in the system who just they all send the same traffic, but we can still separate them by putting a bunch of sensors into the network. And the sensors, what they can do is they can only count packets. That's all they do. So here we can use the separation to then do intersection and try to locate where the senders are. And in that particular case, we have very accurate estimations. The blue areas are the locations where we think the senders are. It's very accurate. We can also reconstruct the route. In this particular case, we have a sender, we have a receiver, and we know where the sender is. That's easy. But where is the receiver? And we have an area that where the receiver could be. And again, this is all done using blind source separation. The last slide, I would like just to show a little bit of some work that we just started to do, and that has to do with voice over IP. Voice over IP, and if it is end-to-end, voice over peer-to-peer, voice over IP has to be a good citizen, so they have to do silent suppression. If people don't talk, we don't send packets. The problem is the moment you do silent suppression, you pass a lot of information to an observer. Here, this is a stream of packets. On the side, we have I don't know what it is, either real maybe or something that shows us what kind of packets are being sent. The moment silent suppression kicks in, we go from a 50 millisecond, 50 milliseconds into packet time, 60 milliseconds into packet time to 100 milliseconds into packet time. That we can detect that, and we can get the length of talk spurts. Once you have the length of talk spurts, you can do two things. One is, three things. One, you can identify who is talking to whom. That's relatively easy because you get the timing pattern of that goes across the network. You can also, there have been some work that based on talk spurts, you know who's the physical person talking. Again, that's not too difficult. Some work that we just started doing is how much information can we get in addition to that? Can we decrypt what actually was said just by getting the timing, the length of the talk spurts? In this particular case here, we have 3 words. I can't remember. We were playing with the children rhyme. Betty bought some butter, something. And so there we have bought some better or something. And so these are histograms of actual voice links on the signal. At the bottom we see histograms of the same signals but over the network. And so what we see there is that we get reasonably accurate estimators of what talk spurt lengths are. And now the question is, what can we do with them? Okay.
Can we get the microphones here on? Can we get the table mics on? All right, I think I'm on now, yeah. So I hope that this has been a surprise, if maybe not even a pleasant one, because this is what we're doing, we the community, and we don't even really know what we're doing yet. This is the very early days. On the other hand, there are lots of things that you can say, so what about? I mean, from a privacy standpoint, there is a risk to being the only person who's got an encrypted laptop because someone might discover that and jump to conclusions as to why you do it. But now, when there is all but a legal mandate that any laptop that's got customer data on it that could identify a human being needs to be encrypted, then the fact that you have an encrypted laptop, even though it's an easy signal to do, there's a so what that follows it. And there's also the difference between what goes on in, say, a naive mixed network and a sophisticated mixed network, and that's one of the reasons why I have Nick Mathewson from the Tor group here. And so, Nick, why, I know that you've written, what the limitations of Tor are and so on, but please tell us more, help us understand what it does and what it can't do.
Well, the current state of the art in traffic analysis resistance kind of breaks down into two fields. One of them, you use things like high latency mixed nets, and then you get implementations like Mixmaster and Mixminion that are suitable for relaying information packets with roughly 1 hour to 1 day order of magnitude latency. And if you do this, you can introduce enough perturbation in timing to hold off traffic analysis for days, weeks, months, or years, depending on how much traffic the network is seeing and how much traffic it resembles each other. This currently is when mixed nets are used in practice. To the best of my knowledge, there has never been a widely deployed network that did actual mixing on anything resembling IP packets, largely because not simply for the traffic analysis reasons, but because when you start randomly reordering and delaying TCP packets, your platform's TCP stack is likely to have a fit and start behaving really, really badly. So you get into another category of currently deployable anonymity networks, which are the low latency ones. These usually use onion routing style designs, which there is some disagreement about whether onion routing is mixing or is not mixing. But given that it does not delay and it does not deliberately delay and it does not deliberately reorder anything, certainly within a stream, things like Tor, the now defunct Freedom Network, Tarzan, and so on that follow an onion routing design generally do not either send IP packets from end to end. They send traffic inside ordered streams that are reconstructed into a new TCP flow on each side of the network. This is, again, more for sane performance than for traffic analysis resistance. Nevertheless, the state of the art there is more or less, if an attacker is watching both ends of a low latency communication, or if they can get into a position to watch both ends of a low latency communication, they can simply win. There are some claimed defenses that may be able to delay this, but the kind of delays that are being claimed, even by the most recent work like Vitaly Shmakov's work on adaptive padding, are currently delaying the amount of traffic required for traffic analysis by 40% or so tops, which is a neat contribution, but it does mean also that you're delaying the amount of traffic needed from 5 seconds order of magnitude to 7 seconds order of magnitude, which in practice isn't a big deal. Gosh, so as for what can be done, really, a lot of the state of the art right now in how to build systems like this does not focus on adversaries who happen to have a global eavesdropping network of their own, adversaries who happen to be controlling a large or eavesdropping on a large number of internet exchanges, or so on. Instead, we are largely focusing on relatively local non-roving, limited resource adversaries, not because we don't think that stronger ones don't exist, but because there's no way currently to resist stronger ones doing traffic analysis attacks. There's no way to claim you can do that, honestly, at this point. And I'm not terribly hopeful that anyone's going to find one in the next 10 years.
And regarding what he just said about internet exchanges, one of the other things that has been interesting and useful as far as traffic analysis, a lot of the large ISPs keep private whom they peer with, like where they meet up with other ISPs to exchange their internet data. And it's perfectly possible to reconstruct both the private and public peering sessions of who peers with whom and even get an idea of what the bandwidth of those links are through traffic analysis. And I know that this was often done when people were trying to negotiate peering arrangements between ISPs. There are route servers that sit at many, many different points over the internet, and by looking at those, you can look at the BGP route feeds of where you get from where. And so when you look at each individual route, you'll see a path of which autonomous systems it's passed through in order to get to that particular route server. So by basically matrixing all the data from these many different route servers, you can see, oh, okay, it came to this point through these other endpoints. They must have a peering link there. That's not public, so they're clearly giving preferred status to this other ISP. All right, when I go to negotiate with their peering, I'm going to say, hey, you're hooking up with Sprint. Why aren't you hooking up with us? And this gives a tactical advantage to you to know what they're doing, even though they have all these NDAs surrounding it. It's still extractable data.
I'll also add in with you here that like all security things, there's the huge question of, so what's your threat model? And I know a lot of people, for example, who want to use a network like Tor because they will say, you know, I want to be able to check my webmail from some location, and I want to use it as a form of a VPN, which it still works as. Or I don't necessarily want my provider, Google, Yahoo, whomever, to know where I'm traveling to, because if they know that I am coming and reading my webmail from this, then they know that I am in a hotel in Las Vegas. It works for that too, because they are in a situation where they're only looking at one end of things. They are not the attacker that we're talking about who can look at the entire network. Attackers who can only look at a part of the network, well, they can do traffic analysis over the piece that they can see, but if that's not a whole lot, if it's only the last hop, then there's not a lot that they can really do. Anybody here want to make a comment before I ask for things from the audience? Because I think it's about time for that.
Well, one thing I actually wanted to bring up that was sort of occurred to me during a conversation, actually sort of reoccurred to me because it's come up a lot with Kevin Bankston the other night. So I don't know how up everyone is on U.S. wiretap law, but it's only a wiretap if they're looking at the content of your communications. If they can, without nearly so much evidence needing to be shown, look at routing information, even at the packet level. And so long as they're not actually looking at something that can't be construed as routing information, then that is far simpler for law enforcement types to get a hold of. This means that, any attack that deduces content from routing information basically circumvents wiretap law as it exists in the U.S. today.
That's a great point, because yes, I mean, in the U.S. there are different statuses of what we would colloquially think of as a wiretap. I mean, there's a full wiretap where somebody's actually listening to things, and then there's what's called a pen register, which in the old days of telephones was merely what numbers that you were calling. And again, think about what can happen by counting packets, and if you know what number was dialed, the time that it was done, and the duration of the call, you can start constructing all sorts of very interesting things. And from a legal standpoint, there's sort of a two-edged sword here, which is that can you, because you're only looking at routing information on a lower level of surveillance, get more information, or does that mean that the lower level of surveillance is actually something that requires a higher level of permission?
And that doesn't even cover cases where the data is voluntarily disclosed. I mean, one of the things that I saw recently, the phone records for the DC Madam were published. And before people started digging in and looking up who had what phone number at what time, a lot of the people I know covering the DC political beat were just doing traffic analysis on the released databases and saying, okay, so who called this number 57 times? Who did she call? And I was initially feeling very sorry for this woman's hairdresser and manicurist and pizza delivery person, because they're going to show up as fairly frequent callers in this kind of analysis, and they may be tracked down by interested parties attempting to find out who was using her services.
But then that's also part of the so what part of the traffic analysis. I mean, if you know that a person of interest has been calling one number a whole lot, do you know that that is a colleague or is it the hairdresser? You have to then do certain levels of analysis, and actually, the high frequency ones are probably going to be just as meaningless as the low frequency ones. It's going to be the middle things where the real information is. Now, are there any questions out there? Yes.
Forgive my ignorance, but who are these people who actually have access to both ends of the communication?
The question was, who is it who has access to both ends of the communication? It is alleged that various governments have access to various parts of some network. I mean, we hypothesize a whole lot about what the U.S. government can do. We know a lot about what the Chinese do. We know what other people do. A lot of this traffic analysis, though, can be done on your own by constructing your own system. I mean, for example, the things that Raven was talking about. Suppose that you want to find out who's got peering relationships with whom, because you want to know that the people that you're dealing with have a special agreement with Sprint, so why aren't you getting that? You can just start pinging things. And because the pings are returning things, you're generating your own flows, and you can start doing things like that. So to a certain extent, anybody can do this. And when you think about advanced things where, suppose that you find one node in a bot network, and you know that this bot network has somewhere between, say, 500 and 100,000 nodes. You could start using traffic analysis techniques to start leapfrogging from that one node to the rest of it. That's one of the things that I hope in the next few years that people are going to figure out is that we can start to figure out exactly who's in a bot network by doing traffic analysis between the members of it.
And it really is going to depend on what the system is that you're analyzing, who's going to have access to the data at what point. Indeed, in a lot of cases, people will set up a contrived system around their subject of interest just so that they can control the places where you watch.
In practice for anonymity networks today, most of the ones that are very large are either volunteer operated or single provider operated. So in the volunteer operated case, to watch both ends, you try to manipulate the routing algorithm as best you can, or just hope you get lucky and wind up at the start and the end of something of interest. And if you wait long enough and paths are randomly generated, which isn't always the case if you're being sensible, but not everyone is sensible, then eventually you will see a sample of your target's traffic. Additionally, as for people who have very large, who can watch a lot of data, so the internet is not a little bunch of small node ISPs that peer with each other in a mom and pop basis. Nearly everything goes over very large backbone ISPs, and nearly all traffic between large providers is exchanged at small numbers of very concentrated exchange sites. These are points of vulnerability for data collection point of view. There's been a couple of papers about, so how many points do you actually need to watch in order to get a view of most of the traffic entering and leaving your typical anonymity network? And the answer is, if you can get the right couple of, if you can bribe the right 4 or 5 people at level 3, you're pretty much set for 70-80% of the traffic.
Or even buy them a beer and get them to slip the right little thing that will allow you to then to leapfrog things. There are also other things that people think are useful that may not be. For example, running things on alternate ports. Running something on an alternate port is not going to help you if Ricardo can tell whether or not it's IRC traffic. He's going to know that it's IRC traffic because he can pull this out of an IPsec tunnel. He can extract out what's what type of traffic. So running something on an alternate port isn't really going to help because they can tell still. If somebody is in fact looking at, say, imagine you have a compromised node that is using something like port knocking. I will hit port 50,000 and then it will open up port 137 and I'll use 137 for something. Traffic analysis is going to figure this out. Really, you just start seeing the patterns come right out and they leap there. And these are things that somebody can do as defensive techniques in addition to surveillance techniques, is that you can figure out what a hostile node is doing based upon patterns that it's doing that are not necessarily obvious to the people who did it. Yeah. No.
Has anyone looked at the security of these PNAPs that you're talking about? Because that would probably be the best point of entry for anyone. Just a regular idiotic hacker.
The question was, has anybody looked at the security of these PNAPs because that's the obvious point of entry for a hacker?
I have. I've been kind of yelling at them for about 5 years about what they need to do, and the concerns of the ISP community are primarily operational and only secondary security. They don't suck. They're not awful, but there are things that I think that they could do to improve how they are setting up now, and they've made improvements over the last 5 years, but a lot of what goes on in the operational ISP community, they need to see a demonstrable physical attack or a demonstrable working exploit in the wild before they consider that it's a big serious problem. And a lot of the things that are less proven in the oh my god look sense are sort of backburnered until they become a real problem. And there are working groups and there are people who are concerned about this, but it takes a certain amount of inertia that needs to be overcome. And so it's not as good as it could be.
What kind of physical measures do they employ?
What kind of physical measures do they employ?
Usually you have to be on a list of approved people in order to get into the site. There have been pen tests where people have subverted that, showing up wearing the correct uniform and saying, yep, I'm here to fix your electricity, but that's gotten better over the past several years. They usually have cages protecting all the equipment and circuits that are relatively physically shielded, but that only goes as far as the building. If you're outside the building and you cut the power, they're still screwed. They do have backup generators on site, but we saw actually a lot of disaster recovery covers these same bases where, when something like September 11th happened, a lot of the NAPs that were in New York City and downtown had to run on the backup generators, and getting fuel to those over the destroyed streets kind of pushed that time limit. So we see sort of test cases in awful scenarios like that.
So then what's the security like at the disaster recovery sites? Because if you cut the power off the primary site and have your attacker at the
Is this on topic?
that's where you need.
Well, it's not that they have separate failover sites. Some of them do, some of them don't. The question was, what's the security like at the disaster recovery sites? But a lot of them have on-site, at the primary site, backup generators and things like that that are meant to cover the physical infrastructure.
Jim, did you have a question?
I just have a separate question. It's more research-oriented on the traffic analysis, described as being primordial, sort of, and I had a question on this. Are you aware of any research dealing with fraud and the application of traffic analysis through fraud? Do you think this would be a good tool for that?
The question was, do I know of anything about applying traffic analysis to click fraud and other forms? I do not know. I don't know of any. I believe that would be precisely the sorts of things that would be useful for this. That some of the stuff that we were talking about is that old things that were OS hacks ages ago that have come up again is that if you have something that is driven by a timer, it's going to go off at the 1/100th of a second. plus or minus interrupt delays and so on and so forth. So if you start seeing clicks coming in that are all correlated to a single clock, which you only need for Fourier analysis to come out of, you might deduce that that might be click fraud, just like you might deduce that these $1 purchases might represent a stolen credit card.
Yeah, and if I can sort of generalize that, one of the really neat things about this field from a traffic analysis research point of view, and one of the really unfortunate things about this field from a resisting traffic analysis point of view, is that the math you need to do traffic analysis is far simpler than the techniques that you use to try to resist any degree of traffic analysis. So for instance, currently the best techniques against high latency mixed nets don't really require anything much more complicated than summation, long division, and maybe a couple of matrix multiplies if you really care that much. Yeah. This is not something that you need this is not something you need 2 or 3 years of statistics to write decent papers about and find new things in. Several years of statistics would help, but honestly, intro high school statistics will still break nearly all naive designs on resisting this stuff. Yeah. And I would not think you would need anything more complicated than long division and some ad hoc techniques to do timing analysis on the first 20 click fraud algorithms you would come up with.
Yeah, the creativity is going to be where all of you come up with the, oh my God, I know I can solve a problem with that. Just like Jim said, click fraud. We could detect click fraud this way. There's going to be all sorts of things where he'll say, geez, I'll bet we could do that. And the rest of us who've been thinking about this haven't had the time or the inclination to apply it to whatever we're doing. But this is a great technique that has not been used, and it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's extraordinarily hard to defend against. So that means that no matter which side you're on as an attacker or a defender, it's a great tool for you. I believe that we're about done here, so I'm going to just leave it at that unless there's anyone who wants to say anything else. Nope, we're done.